for joining us tonight. The past 2 weeks have been really busy, both in the news and for Mama. In states across the country, from New Jersey and Massachusetts to Colorado and Arkansas, just to name a few, elected leaders have announced plans to finally make their schools go smartphone free. From governors to attorney generals, our elected officials are beginning to take action, and I couldn't be more excited to see it. This groundswell is exactly what we need to both make change in our schools and also just to start making cultural change in how our kids interact with technology. With support from a group called Human Change, I also had the opportunity to speak at the Future House at the World Economic Forum in Davos last month. From engaging in onstage conversations with change makers like Jonathan Haidt and professor and author of The Anxious Generation, and Dr. Mitch Prinstein, who's the Chief Science Officer at the American Psychological Association, to conversation with attendees, it was clear to me that parents everywhere, all over the globe, are facing the very same concerns about how technology is affecting children and their well-being. All of this is why I'm so excited about this Expert Insight Series conversation. It couldn't be more timely. For tonight's edition of Mama's Expert Insight Series, we're going to be speaking with Emily Cherkin, author of the Screentime Solution, and Dr. Jim Winston Jr., an addiction expert and the founder of the Winston Family Initiative in Technology and Adolescent Brain Development. Together, we're going to talk about how media addiction affects kids and teens differently than adults. Excuse me. And we're going to talk about the warning signs of addictions and what you can do to prevent and also address media addiction at home and in your community. So thank you, Emily, and thank you, Jim, for being with us tonight. Jim, if you can come off camera when you're ready, it would be appreciated. And I have to thank all of you for bearing with me while I deal with whatever winter crud is going around, because I seem to have this congestion. Thanks for being here, Jim.
For having me.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So my first question is for Emily. Unlike any previous generation in all of our species' history, children today are growing up with excessive screen use, and that screen use at home and in school impacts their mental health and their family relationships. For our listeners who haven't read your book, The Screentime Solution, can you introduce to us the concept of becoming tech intentional?
Sure, thank you. So one of the things that's really interesting is that as I started this work, I realized I kept saying things like, well, I'm not anti-tech, I'm tech intentional. And then I realized that that was a word I sort of had made up, and I actually trademarked it 5 years ago. So it ended up being a good thing. My definition for tech intentional is using screen-based technologies that enhance, nurture, and support ourselves, our children, and our families in a way that aligns with our values, while also resisting, delaying, and limiting screen use that interferes with healthy mental, physical, cognitive, and emotional development, which is a mouthful. So my TLDR, which is too long, don't read, is this: later is better, less is more, relationships and skills before screens.
That is an incredible summary, because it is hard to sort of boil down all of the complexities. And at Mama, we are referring to media addiction, not necessarily in a clinical sense, although we know clinical addiction can result from different products. But we're talking about our society's media addiction and the way in which tech overuse, the lack of regulations, and all these things together have caused us to not be intentional about when we consume media, when we use technology, and all the things you just mentioned. Jim, you have significant clinical experience with addiction. Can you just start by telling us how you made the connection between the addiction work you were doing and more traditional notions of addiction and what you were seeing with your own kids and their smartphones?
So it wasn't with my own kids, because I delayed giving them smartphones until they were 14, which made me a very unpopular dad. It was walking my kids into school, and this is probably 6, 7, 8 years ago, and walking down the sidewalk, and all the upper school students were going the opposite direction. And almost to a number, they were all glued to their phones, and they would bump into us frequently. Some would say sorry, but they would not look up. And to me, as an addiction guy, the magnetic pull of the device was overwhelming, and this is important in the etiology of addiction, their survival instinct, because some of them would fall off the sidewalk, and it was interfering with that basic self-care function. And for the first time, I really tried to put it together. And once I began to kind of dig in, these devices are architecturally constructed to capture our attention. And in that way, they're really strategically designed to be addictive. I think we can all see that. But I think they've slipped into our culture and have been woven in. And I want to kind of ping off Emily just for a second that part of what makes this technology qualitatively different from an addiction framework, again, is the fact that you can carry it around in your pocket. So access to a drug is a critical ingredient in the development of any addiction. And so it's really 24/7 access. Can you imagine a gambler being able to carry around a slot machine? It's essentially the same thing. So that's how I got involved.
One of the things among many that contributed to my starting Mama was a text I got from a mom I know who asked me for help with her son's addiction. And she texted that she felt like he was addicted to cocaine that she gave him because
Mm.
she had given him the phone. And it was such a heartbreaking metaphor. Um, Jim just mentioned the way in which these products are designed to addict.
Mm.
Emily, I've heard you say that persuasive design should really be described as manipulative tech instead. How does tech manipulate and tap into the brains of kids?
Well, I'm definitely going to defer to Jim on the actual brain part, but the way I explain it to parents is that it's not you versus your child. It is you versus a hijacked neural pathway that you will never be more effective, more powerful, more interesting than that dopamine that's just flowing every time you're engaging with the screen. The other thing that I think is extremely important to address here is because we often will talk about solutions. What do we do? How do we protect kids? But it is extremely important to emphasize that it is the business model of technology to hook and hold our attention. And that is the manipulative and extractive part that makes this, what I say, it's just not a fair fight. You are not ever going to be able to combat the business model. And so I feel for your friend, because I hear that from parents too. I feel like it's my fault. And what I say to parents is it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to understand this. And your children are being, well, not just your children, right? Look at us, like we're scrolling, we're having our own issues balancing media. But it's extremely important that we understand that that is by design, that the design is to hook and hold us because, as we know, the business model is all about advertising. And that is how they get us to see more ads, is by staying on longer.
We'll talk in a minute a little more about design and about data. But Jim, can you kind of help us understand how after the first couple of years of life, adolescence is the second most critical time in brain development because it's driven by the need for social connection. I know in your words, you've said before that need for social connection is as powerful an instinct as hunger. So how does that make teens more vulnerable to social media? Or if you prefer, can you talk a little bit about how technology affects young minds when in early development, and then again when they're adolescents?
So there are two things. The brain really from 9 to 14, we call it puberty, but from a neurobiological perspective, the brain kind of atrophies. It gets rid of connections that are no longer useful, and it begins to build new ones. And that really begins to form the foundation, the concrete highway for the rest of your life, let's call it. So during that period of time, if you look at an MRI of a baby, and then at 5 or 6, the brain is full of dendrites, the system. And then by 10 or 11, it really thins out. So it's a critical period for developing the highway system. So if you're on your screen for a significant period of time, and all the research shows that adolescents and young adults are on it roughly 9 hours a day, that's an enormous amount of attachment, I call it. As a psychologist, attachment is the currency of value in human development, really. And where our attention goes, our attachment grows. So kids are desperate. They move from parent-centric to peer centric. And so they're spending an enormous amount of time connecting through a screen with their friends. Most studies show on average, kids have 70% of their relationships are now through a screen. And as we were talking earlier, Julian, I don't want to drone on, but that is.
Well, I mean, you said something earlier that was really important before this session started, and maybe you could mention that again. And us talking through the screen right now is very different than if we were in the same room. If we were in the same room, my experience of you would be sensory beyond just the visual or auditory. So those sensory experiences shape what happens in our brain. And for children, those sensory inputs actually shape their neural pathways. So what is the cost of all of this time going through screen on a child or adolescent's brain development?
Well, I think we're seeing it in the Surgeon General's mental health crisis, right? Kids increases in anxiety, depression, for girls in particular, cutting suicidal ideation. And my sort of piece to the puzzle that made me sort of make sense of it all was we have an ancient brain that's 30,000 years, wherever you want to mark it. And it was designed, the hardware system that we all carry around in our heads today was designed to absorb, as you put it, sensory, I call it visceral input. And it's extraordinarily dimensional. You think about touch, voice quality, inflection, the energy of being with someone. And now that kids are relating, you can call it attaching, and I think that's an important principle. Through a screen, it's devoid of any of that visceral nutrition. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that in the rise in anxiety and depression. You know, I was talking about the difference between sugar and fruit and sugar and candy. One is packed with nutrition, the other is devoid. It's the same thing through a screen is devoid. And I think we're in the beginning of seeing what's going to happen to our kids who are raised primarily because most parents, very well intentioned, have no idea that, in my opinion, they give their kid a phone at 4, they might as well be giving them a slot machine.
I love that phrase, visceral nutrition. I think it's such a beautiful way of explaining what kids need, what we all need, and what's missing. Sometimes I talk about it to say that all of the social media and technology that's designed to amplify sticky content, which is content that is most shocking, most outrageous, violent, all of those things, it's causing us all kinds of emotional anxiety. And at the very same time, we're depriving ourselves as a species of all of the visceral interpersonal experiences that we know from millennia are what give us emotional comfort, give us stability, help us feel safe. We're talking tonight about addiction, but I think we also have to talk a little bit about data. Emily, you're also a co-founder of the Student Data Privacy Project, a group dedicated to protecting children's data and privacy in schools. Why is protecting data and student data so important?
I have a good quip for you, which is this: ed tech is just big tech in a sweater vest. And the reason I say that is because the business models are identical. So we know that our email platforms and our social media platforms are collecting all kinds of information about us all the time. It's why it's free, right? We are the product. And unfortunately, that is also true of how the tech platforms are being used in school. And so our effort was really to sort of test the efficacy of FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Initially, this was 2019, I think, that we started this project. And what we found, here's the TLDR, was that FERPA isn't really being meaningfully enforced, nor has it been updated meaningfully since 1974, which is fascinating. A lot of changes in tech since then. And so where is the lever by which we have a say over what's happening with not only our data, which is one problem, but the data of our children? And what I find is that, I mean, people are barely at the point where we're talking about, getting phones out of school, and there's movement around that. But when we start talking about data, people's eyes kind of glaze over and like, oh yeah, they know what I'm doing. But it's very different when we're talking about children, and we're not talking about consent, and we're not talking about what's happening with that data or the potential harms later in their lives.
Earlier in this Expert Insight series, I had a conversation with the New York City Health Commissioner, and he described how, because of the National Emergency of Youth Mental Health and because of the shortage of providers, New York City had arranged an online therapy service that allowed access for millions of kids who otherwise wouldn't have been able to get help. This week, the website Gizmodo reported that after New York City paid $26 million to a company called Talkspace for that free therapy, that Talkspace was allegedly using a wide array of tracking pixels to collect the teen's personal information and then sending it to TikTok, Meta, Snap, and other social media companies, which were the same companies that the city is suing for harming teen mental health. Emily, you are the lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit against this one's against PowerSchool, which calls itself an ed tech company. And it is the world's largest provider of cloud-based software for K through 12 schools. And the lawsuit alleges that they are selling student data, including health and disciplinary records, to third-party partners, and doing so without the informed consent of kids or their parents. So what can you tell us about the lawsuit and how collected data might be dangerous?
Yes. So because this is pending case, the only thing I can say specifically about it is that we are alleging that PowerSchool is indeed collecting, using, selling, sharing our kids' information without effective or meaningful consent. More broadly, again, this is true of all the platforms because they are by nature an extractive, manipulative business model. And so again, when I say ed tech is just big tech in a sweater vest, all of the same problems with social media is happening with the platforms our children are using in school. And, actually Talkspace was used here in Seattle in our district, or there was a proposal to use it. Same exact concerns come up. I want to see that. I believe it's great. People's intentions are often good, that they want to help teen mental health. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it is a problematic thing when we rely on a digital tool to solve that problem when that business model is going to be manipulative and harmful. So I would love to point people to the Internet Safety Labs. It's an independent research group that doesn't take money from tech, and they do excellent reporting. But one data point that I always find fascinating is that, first of all, most schools in the US use ed tech products of some kind, and that on average, districts use 125 unique platforms per district. So even if you think you know what one company is doing, there's 125 others that are doing something different or the same, and it's all bad. And so it's hard to know how to help. And of course, one of their reports found that 96% of these ads share personal information with third parties. So this is not unique to PowerSchool, it is the model.
And when data is collected, it enables these algorithms to become even more targeted, even more specific. Jim, I have a question for you about social media. Does social media and these social media algorithms trigger the brain in the same way as drugs and alcohol? And does it affect kids' ability to read, focus? Is it fair to think about social media like drugs or alcohol?
So I think it's important to recognize that inside our brain, we always get focused on content, alcohol or cocaine or whatever. But inside your brain doesn't care about content. It cares about something called salience, which really means the charge, where you get the charge, right? So that's what drives neurobiological development. I want to just quickly share a study that, for me, when I first read it maybe 4 or 5 years ago, was horrifying. A woman did put kids in MRIs, and she showed them a picture of, let's call it a nice teddy bear, and looked at what part of the brain lit up. And then she showed them a picture of something horrifying. Supposed to, and in the beginning, you see the part of the brain that's survival based, means move away, right? So the next study was the same kids, the same teddy bear, the same scary picture, but with likes in the corner and a bunch of likes. And kids overrode their survival instinct and liked the picture. So that shows you the power of kids need to belong, to feel included, the tribal instinct, when I call it as powerful an instinct as hunger, and that being weaponized at scale is really a horrifying proposition. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we lost you, and that I hope he comes back on in a minute. But my next question was for you anyway, Emily. So, do you think there's ever a scenario where an app or product that kids use online should be considered safe? I mean, can kids use technology as tools the way adults do?
Okay, the short answer is not yet or no. More nuanced is that under the current business model, as I keep talking about, no, because there are three questions that we really need to be asking about any tech tool for children, whether that is at school or social media or home, whatever. Is it safe? Is it effective? And is it legal? And until all three of those are a resounding yes, and they're not currently, then the answer should be no. They shouldn't be allowed. We should certainly not be giving them at school. Now, I want to say that what I believe, like I said in the beginning, is I'm not anti-tech. I do believe children need technological skills. They need to know how to type. I cannot tell you how many children have one-to-one devices at school and don't know how to type. That is developmentally complete nonsense. So typing is important. We need to teach children about mis and disinformation. We need to teach them about how to cite sources. What is plagiarism? How do you know when you can trust what someone is saying online? That is all the more important than ever before. That is not, for the most part, what is happening with the way tech is being used in school. And I always like to distinguish. Ed tech is not the same as tech ed. And we need tech ed, not more ed tech.
I like that way of talking about it. Sometimes I use air quotes when I refer to ed tech because so often we find that these products are not designed by educators or
Exactly.
physicians or developmental specialists. They're designed by companies with the motive of profit. Jim, you didn't miss anything because I had a question for Emily. And I was just going to ask you if you could introduce the work you're doing at the Winston Center a bit and talk to us about the materials and the curriculum you developed there.
So there are two parts to this. One of them is a national center at UNC Chapel Hill. We started that about 3 or 4 years ago because in doing some research, I consider this a social change movement. I think we've been at the vanguard of it. And if you look at every social change movement throughout history, you can talk about cigarettes and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. The collection of hard apolitical science is really what was the tipping point. It was the kind of the final thing that really couldn't be debated and began to change people's minds about cigarettes and alcohol in these two cases. So I wanted to fund a research center that did hard apolitical science to see what happens inside the brain. So the center has fMRIs. We've got a longitudinal study going on, a 10-year longitudinal study. It has about 160 kids following them from third grade for 10 years, trying to really determine what happens in the brain. There was an article published in JAMA Pediatrics, it'll be 2 years ago, that showed kids on average are picking up their phones 100 times a day, that there is a correlation. They couldn't quite parse it to get calls, but they're showing changes in the exact same places of the brain associated with every other addiction. So that's what we're doing. And then we have a curriculum that has been taught at Chapel Hill. Now, this is in the end of the fourth year, basically trying to explore what's happening to the brain. And I've had it with a friend of mine at school. Now we're teaching it in middle school and upper school, which really talks about the addictive process, the neurobiology, the social emotional consequences. So we're trying to educate folks.
What are students' reaction to taking that course? I'd love to hear more about it.
Some of them are blown away. After the first semester at Chapel Hill, 6 students came and formed a student organization called Students for Social Science. So they're all aware. I think the interesting part is that people can say, yes, I'm addicted, and do nothing about it. The magnetic pull of these devices is really quite powerful. But it's one piece of a many-piece puzzle of trying to educate people. I think the real fulcrum here is educating parents. And most well-intentioned parents, if they knew that these devices were designed to be addictive, that they were going to grab and hold their kids' brains and change it, would delay giving it. And I'm running on, but one last very important study that was sort of mind-boggling to me. They did a longitudinal study from 13 to 21 with cigarettes and alcohol, and they found that every year you delayed access from 13, you had a 4.5% decreased chance of developing substance abuse or dependency or nicotine dependency. So if you think about delaying, it makes sense neurobiologically because the brain is still forming. In adolescence, it's all gas and no brakes. You don't have executive function. You don't have a prefrontal cortex. Insurance car companies know that they don't rent until they're 25 because the executive functioning part develops much later. It's the newest part of the brain, but it develops the latest.
And it takes time to develop, and it's predicated on other skills being established in the brain, right? It's sort of a higher order skill. So part of why we're in such a predicament now, I think, is because we are displacing the acquisition of those lower level skills, which make it even harder to reach success with, excuse me, executive function and higher order skills.
Correct.
Going back to what you said about most parents knowing, I mean, I've often said, if you went to the toy store and there was a label on the toy that said buying this for your kid is going to increase their likelihood of developing a mental health problem, or give your kid a 1 in 5 chance of developing an eating disorder, or a 1 in 10 chance of being suicidal, nobody would buy that for their kid. But until now, we still don't have warning labels on social media. And because there wasn't a big body of research, I think it's very important what you mentioned earlier about having apolitical science to really, give people a guidepost. That said, isn't it kind of difficult, though, to measure the full impact of how technology is affecting kids? Because we can measure an individual and their tech use, but our whole society has changed. My neighbor was talking about sending her daughter to the store to buy a birthday gift. And it was the first time she went by herself to pick it out for a friend. And when she went to pay, they didn't take cash. So they only took credit cards. We're interacting with machines at the stores. We're interacting with screens in elevators and restaurants. So how can any study even fully capture the entirety of how childhood is different today than in times past? I don't know.
I don't think that the entirety of it can ever be assessed, but for example, we developed a withdrawal study where we're putting these are college students in an fMRI and then taking all their devices. And get this, the longest we could get these kids to agree to was 24 hours. Okay, so after 24 hours, and there are all kinds of tasks they're given to, they're putting the fMRI again, and we're trying to show that the withdrawal symptoms, even after 24 hours, are the same as, because it's well documented with alcohol, cocaine, some of the amphetamine products, to see if it's the same. And we're all hypothesizing that it's the same.
Wow.
You've got to come at it from different angles. Withdrawal is one of the critical variables in the development of an addiction diagnosis, right?
And can you share with the audience, what is fMRI?
It's just it requires a much more delicate and detailed, it's in the basement of a building. The concrete floor is much thicker, so any vibrations, trucks going by are ruled out. So you have to get it that fine to really assess the subtle changes that are happening.
So with sort of the big change we saw in the 20th century around big tobacco, research really did set that off. But to make the change happen, we saw a shift in regulation. We saw organized resistance and groups forming. We saw a change in education and in our cultural products, like in Hollywood. At Mama, we're all about movement building. And Emily, in your book, you talk about how building a movement around tech intentionality and how that is good for everyone, children and adults alike. Can you say more about why you think a movement is required here?
Because we can't do this alone. And, we're stronger together. What Jim was saying too, where the attention goes, what was it? That was such a great line. The attachment grows. Yeah. And I love that. I wrote it down because we need each other. And the metaphor that I use in the book and that I'm talking about with parents is this idea of a school of fish swimming around in the ocean. And, how does it know when to change direction? Well, it takes one fish to sort of peel away and start that motion of movement. But actually, it takes a second and a third fish to catch up and start that entire shift. So I like to talk about, look, some of us here are first fish, and we've been doing this for a while. We're really passionate. We really need the second and third fish too. And so I'm always looking for other first fish and other second fish because it's going to take us all working together. I also think at the end of the day, I am an optimist. I feel like change is possible. Humans are amazing. I worry about what we're doing with children in particular in terms of their prefrontal cortex and lack of skills that are not getting built and the displacement of all these human experiences. But I think you're absolutely right. The more we can help inform parents. And I would argue that parents also, I said this before, they don't need, it's not their fault, it's our responsibility. And I would add that we also need to find a little bit more courage in our own parenting. And I think this is really hard in a parent community era where we are raised ourselves as parents on 24/7 horrible news headlines that increases our anxiety. And so I love the story about your friend their kid walking to school. It's not fun about the money part, but I know Lenore Skenazy and the Let Grow movement is all about independence and autonomy and how absolutely an important component that is that screens take away from. So it's going to take all of us, all these great organizations to do that, but we're better together.
In just a minute, I'm going to start opening this up for Q&A. And so I invite anyone watching to put questions you might have into the Q&A box. But before we do, I have another question for you, Emily. We talk a lot about how we can protect kids, but I often think about how we as adults can model good tech behavior. Anything you want to say about this? I read your piece in GQ on making a New Year's resolution to break up with your tech addiction. What are some things we can do as parents to show that we too are addressing our own addiction?
Yeah, and to Jim's point too, like that brain, even for adults, like even if they're fully formed by whatever 25, 30, we're still struggling. So why would we think it's easier for kids? It's not. My favorite tip to give, and it's free and it's easy, and you start yourself as a parent, is to live your life out loud. And what I mean by that is you narrate what you do as you do it. So I'm reaching for my phone, I'm checking the time, I'm going to see what time soccer is, what's the weather, like constant play by play. And I always joke that it's working when your kids roll their eyes because that's totally developmentally normal. And the idea is you do it first, because a lot of this, and Jim, you can second this, I hope, is that there's research that how we as parents use our devices is very much an impact on how our children use devices. And so at the very least, doing that and modeling the behavior we want to see is going to have an impact on our children. And also, second tip I would highly recommend is get your phone out of your bedroom. It's something like 95% of us leave them in our bedrooms. I do not. And that's good for all of us. So that is a really easy thing you can do tonight. And it does start with us. So thank you. That's a good question.
We spend money in our family on regular old alarm clocks. They don't have any function, but when you have an alarm clock, you don't actually need to sleep next to your phone.
And it's not connected to social media. I always joke I should get a kickback from the alarm clock industry because of all the times I talk about alarm clocks. So yeah, I second you on that.
Jim, as I mentioned at the start, I was just on a panel with Mitch Prinstein recently from APA. How has his work influenced what you're doing at the Winston Center? And what can parents learn about the findings from your work and the curriculum you've developed?
So Mitch is who I hired to run the center, he and Professor Eva Telzer. So we all developed this curriculum. So it's really been a collaborative effort. So I want to pivot just for a second because I think it's germane here. I want to slow something way, way down. If you think about what happens when a 12-year-old is sending a text to a friend of his or hers, and let's say it's a hurtful or mean text, if you think about the kind of bubble that creates around the person, what's missing, if you can then pivot to, if you were to say the exact same thing to the person in person, right, face to face, if you think about the complementary dynamics that would go, you would read that it hurt them, you would see their facial expressions, you would watch all that, and that is information for the person saying that to adjust, to hopefully say I'm sorry, all those kinds of interpersonal dynamics. So this is related to a study that shows that empathy in kids is down 40%. And I think you can really understand why, because if you're in a bubble, meaning you don't see the reaction, you have no way to input the consequences of an idle, oh, I think you're ugly or whatever. And that to me is one of the most principled examples of why kids should. And let me tell you, my kids were they didn't get phones until they were 14, and they were the only ones in their grade for 4 years. For 4 years. So it was horrible. I hated they felt left out. But that's why, because if you put a screen, they are incapable. They're not lazy or unwilling. They are incapable of resisting the magnetic pull. It is beyond their capacity. And I think it's unfair to put that onus on kids. I think it really has to be parents who say no and be able to tolerate being disliked. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I was verbally disliked for not giving them phones. But I understand that the damage done to all those faculties that I consider preeminently human, empathy, the ability to read long form material, I think that's going to disappear.
It
All
already has, Jim. I don't know if you've seen The Atlantic, but I mean, the Atlantic magazine had a story recently about the college students who can't read books. We are seeing reading scores and math scores in this country. Last year, it was at the lowest level since we started measuring in 1971. And the latest scores that just came out last week are even lower. So, I'm fearful about what's going to happen to reading. I'm fearful about mass literacy. I mean, mass literacy wasn't always a condition in our species. It only is something that we attained in the 20th century after a lot of work by a lot of people. I mean, I love how you just expressed that. You said the faculties you consider that make us human. Am I saying that right?
Definitely human. They're the ones that I consider the hallmark of evolutionary biology in humans. And there was a study out of Australia that showed that the visual cortex, there's indications that it is now expanding. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Visually, kids are going all over the place. They're distracted every 10 seconds. So I think it's just changing the definition existentially, I think, of what it means to be human. And I'd like to hold on to some of those. Certainly empathy. Our world is heading into some tough times, and we need people who can be thoughtful and be really engender critical thinking, because these problems are not easy to solve. And I think that is a quality that's being stripped down.
We have some questions for the audience. And before I get to them, I just wanted to add one thing to what you said. If a child sends a message that's not face-to-face, they're not getting the feedback about their behavior. But also, I've heard reports and I've seen and met kids who have routinely seen things on their phone that are completely horrific, like watching a car accident or watching a shooting. And if they experience that with adults around or with their peers, they would witness all of the other reactions. They would know this is not common. This is scary. This is dangerous. But alone in their sort of private space with their screen, they're getting none of that feedback, which is really, troubling, and part of why I think we have a poly crisis, not just in mental health, but in other aspects of society. So we have a question from someone named Maggie. As parents, we don't have any issue with boundaries and supervisions around tech, but it seems like we're the only ones. And once our teen's phone is turned in, almost every one of her friends still has theirs. So she feels like she isn't connected. How do we find the parents who are also setting these stricter boundaries around teen tech use? So one thing you could do is join Mama and find a local chapter, or you could start your own chapter. Emily, do you have other ideas for that?
Yeah, I mean, my daughter is 13 and doesn't have a phone, and my son was 14 when he got his. I'm feeling very strongly that we are first fish in this, and Maggie, you may be as well. And this is hard, and it matters. And to everything that Jim just said, I was nodding so vigorously, because we have to remember that that's why. And sometimes if you think of it as like giving the phone might make them feel better socially in the moment, but what if you think it's bad now? wait until you give it, right? Like the FOMO, all of the social stuff that comes with the fallout from having it is only going to get worse. So I actually think it becomes more about empowering our kids to normalize the fact that we don't have to have these. This is not a requirement. And I get very frustrated when the message is like, well, that's just the way things are now. It doesn't have to be. And if we just placidly accept that, then we'll never make changes. So I really, yes, it's hard, and yes, it matters, is what I would say.
We have a mama chapter leader who decided to get an old-fashioned landline in her house
Yep.
and convinced a dozen of her friends to do the same things. And they've been teaching their kids how to dial a phone, how to talk to an adult, and how to leave a message, how to ask for things. And those are basic skills, right? Like those are things that everybody should be learning. Um, uh, I'm glad you said that about the not a requirement. We have another question here from Laura, who you might know, who said, can we push the envelope a little and discuss the kids and teens using these products is not a requirement? She said, you all know I gave my son a chainsaw, albeit electric, instead of a phone when he turned 14. He's now 15 and doing fine without a phone. He's a member of the local volunteer fire department, so he's not in a bubble. What else can parents do?
You have to find experiences. And again, I realize we're putting a lot on parents, right? Which is part of the problem, right? This, again, it's not their fault. The tech industry created these problems, but we give them. And so we have to find the replacements. We have to find the alternative experiences. And that is hard, and it's costs resources and time and effort, but it's nothing good was ever done because it was easy. I always say that we learn in moments of friction. We need friction. We need to struggle. We need to have adversity. Kids need to be disappointed and mad. Those are all important parts of life skills. And so, yeah, it's hard. And yes, we have to look for other options. We have to displace the screen with something else.
So we have a question that says, I've recently spoken to some young women, 18 to 23, and to me, an alarming number report that their partners, mostly male, have a very unhealthy relationship with pornography. We all know keeping out inappropriate content to our children is like drinking from a fire hose. Any studies regarding the effects of early exposure to pornography?
They're horrifying. I mean, you can think of all the ways they are: the objectification, the idealization. Real relationships have so much nuance and good and bad. And the more time you spend looking at an idealized image, reality not only can't compete, it becomes kind of repugnant after a while. And it is there's not one study that doesn't indicate a horrifying consequence.
I recently learned something, and I have not put my hands on this data yet. So, but I learned from a pretty trustworthy source that there's recent data out about a rise in erectile dysfunction in young men in their early 30s. And they believe it's a direct result of pornography addiction and how sort of the development of unhealthy sexual habits is causing this problem in otherwise very healthy men. So I think there's a wide array of ramifications. Also, quickly, Jim, I know that at Boston Children's Hospital, for example, in their digital wellness lab, that they've been trying to parse different types of addiction related to media and technology. Pornography addiction, gaming addiction, online shopping addiction, social media addiction. Are these things sort of the same? Are they different?
Sure.
Do parents need
Yeah.
to, what do you think?
In terms of the brain, they're all the same. They activate, again, the brain runs on salience. So wherever the charge is, the neurobiology develops. So the other thing is dopamine, which we've all heard about, is not about completion. And this is what makes it, I won't say dangerous, but it's all about the anticipation. So it's anticipating the next thing. And I believe that tech companies have weaponized that piece of human neurobiological vulnerability, which is we're always seeking the new. It's part of how we grew and developed and left everything behind, apes behind. And they have weaponized that in a device where it's a parallel digital universe with a limitless supply of dopamine hits. Whatever kind of content porn, shop. It doesn't matter in terms of the brain development. But the other thing to really know, and this is especially true for kids, that if you're given that you're developing the highway system from 9 to 14, 15, if you develop an addictive pathway system, you are in trouble for the rest of your life. And as a clinician who's dealt, I mean, I worked in a federal prison running a drug program for years. The guys in the prison who started earlier had the most difficult time staying sober. And you think of it as willpower. No, it's neurobiology. And during that period, which is why 14, Emily, I don't know where you got your number, but that was my number, because the brain really goes through a neurobiological arc. And it's not that it's complete, but it's certainly over the hump. And if you're developing an addictive pathway system, you're going to be easily distracted. You're always going to be looking outside, not inside. And your inside gets hollowed out over time if everything of, quote, nourishment is through a screen.
So Jim, in an earlier interview that you gave, I saw you talk about how it's better to go through withdrawals now versus later. I mean, I hear a lot of parents say, well, the ship has sailed and there's really too late to do anything about this. Do you agree with that? Or do you think they should tackle addiction at any time?
So I think there are two parts to that. One of them is parents have their own addiction. I mean, let's be honest. I think we're all attached. I left my phone at home one time when I went to work, and I had 20 minutes of anxiety. I know enough that pissed me off. I didn't like that attachment, but kids aren't going to have that contrast position. So I think it's much better earlier on, when you still have time to really clean out your neurobiology and let it start to get the visceral input that it's required for healthy development. That to me is the key. The dimensional, what it looks like, what it feels like, how the voice, all those things are feeding neurobiological development. And during that critical period, that 5-year, 6-year period, I think I think there should be warning labels on phones. I've written an op-ed to that effect.
It was announced today, New York is, Senator Andrew Grunardis is sponsoring a bill for warning labels in New York. So Mama was very excited to support
Good.
that. Emily, which of course the Surgeon General also had proposed last year. Emily, we have a question for you from someone named Megan. She said, I have a meeting in a few days with my child's elementary school principal to talk about ed tech. I have a lot of information to share with her, including about FERPA, how the National PTA takes donations from big tech, and many of the points you make on your website. But what should my ask be? For example, no learning apps at all, or introduce some tech in 5th grade so they can learn to use a laptop, type, and do research? And what should I ask for at my son's middle school?
Well, first of all, thank you for even asking, because this is where we're gonna see some of the change happening. I do have a toolkit on my website, which maybe she has seen. It's called the Unplug EdTech Toolkit, which has a list of questions to ask schools. But I think there's actually something really important in this question, which is like, sometimes parents are sort of told, well, you're just doing this for your kid, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does put an impact on the teachers. And as a former teacher myself, I have a lot of empathy for that. We're also giving teachers 36 students and 36 computers and asking them to keep kids on task and teach. That's ridiculous. So I would like to see a massive opt-out where parents refuse the tech altogether. In the end, I know that's not actually what's the best for all kids, because we do need some skills. But right now, the choices are all or nothing. And so I would rather see nothing until there are warning labels on school computers, or better yet, no school computers, or more specifically, no internet connected school computers. So that would be one nuance to this that you could ask. I'm pretty sure, unfortunately, that they'll say that's not possible, because all the curriculum is digital. If it's a Chromebook, that's what Google needs. If it's, any of their grading platforms are all going to be online. And I think that's the problem. So again, I always invite parents to think about replacing judgment with curiosity, because we don't want to go in, screaming and yelling. I would think it's all about the context of the relationship that you're building, but asking a lot of these questions. Like, I think it's also really great to ask, can you show me the research that this is effective, that this is safe, that this is legal and better for our kids, because it's not true. And side note, be aware of the research that you're citing, because a lot of research is, as you point out, the National PTA is funded by a lot of big tech. So that's just one of those things that when we go in, we need to know that industry funded research might say one thing, but independent research says something else.
Yeah, and I hear a lot from parents when you talk to the schools, they insist the products are safe, and then you say, "How do you know they're safe?" And they say, "Well, the tech companies told us they were safe."
Yeah. Read the
Um,
privacy policy. I mean, that's the other problem is it's like I hear this a lot about testing that, oh, they need it for the testing or they need to learn how to use it so they can take the testing. Opt them out of the testing. I think until there is a national movement of parents saying absolutely not and I refuse because it isn't safe for children, nothing's going to change at the higher level. So I know that is tied into funding and all kinds of stuff. And I'm really sorry to the educators who are going to bear the brunt of this yet again. But the administrators aren't listening, or not enough of them.
so, any thoughts on wait until 8th, pros or cons of that? This is a question from the audience.
I think it from a neurobiological perspective, which is hard science, it's a given. It makes sense to wait until the brain has filled out a little more. There's a little more access to the brake and not all gas. And it also provides the natural pivot to connecting face to face with people. So I think for those reasons, it should be, I'm hoping that within the next 3 to 5 years, that becomes the norm, that there are groups now that don't have tech. I remember when my kids were in 4th grade, they were invited to an iPad party, an iPad party. I mean, it's pretty horrifying. So I think there's neurobiological, it's not just a personal sense, but the neurobiology is, we've understood this for 50 years. We need to put the two things together and see how, I mean, 9 hours a day, 8 hours, that's 4 months a year. That's half their waking time through a screen. The consequences of that are utterly devastating, in my opinion. So it was
I,
tough,
I'm
but it was.
fairly I'm fairly certain that wait until 8th has actually changed the recommendation to be wait until at least 8th. Like
Yeah.
wait until they're in 9th grade, and maybe not even then. The Surgeon General has repeatedly said he won't even consider getting his kids a smartphone or social media until they're in high school, which I think should be the minimum. Although many people in tech companies who I've talked to said they think it should be 18. So that's another way to look at it. And one last question, what about giving a teenager a dumb phone? Do you think that's a good compromise?
I can definitely address that. I'm a big fan of the old school dumb phone, the non-internet connected kind, not the ones that look like mimicking iPhones that come with games and all these other distractions, including the watches. I don't think those are great because of the independence problem. Here's another option that I've been doing with my daughter. We share a phone, which is crazy. She's 13. It's very frustrating. I see all kinds of, we get the group chat thing, but we've had, to Jim's point, so many conversations. Before you respond, why are you feeling upset? Let's sit and think about what are the consequences of firing off an angry text right now. And it's allowed me as a parent to see that, oh my gosh, these kids are getting hundreds of text messages in a 30-minute window, right? That isn't sustainable for anybody for a variety of reasons. So I always say between, share a phone. And I will say to your efforts too, Julie, is like, when schools have phone-free policies from bell to bell, not just during class time, but all day long, you are giving your child the gift of not having to have a phone because they see everyone else in school having one, right? And so there's another side to that argument that really makes parenting a lot easier. So I would just add that too, that's a benefit for parents. You can say, oh, sorry, the school doesn't allow it. So they don't need to know that they don't have a phone yet. So, or that it's a flip phone. So always, yes.
I have a quick anecdote. I gave my, I guess he was 13 at the time, a flip phone. And he was so embarrassed, he deliberately broke it so he wouldn't have to use it. So there is certainly that aspect to it. The other thing that we all know is the research shows that when you take phones out of schools, the academic performance goes up about 6%, and it goes up even more for those kids who have struggle with distraction. To me, that is a no-brainer. It's a no-cost way to increase academic performance. It's unbelievable that it isn't a national policy.
And you have to get rid of the school laptops too, because they do the same thing that phones do. So just gonna throw that one out there.
There's more questions, and I'm sorry to say we're coming to the end of our time together. You both have such a wealth of knowledge. I wish we could talk for another hour, but you know, someone is just asking, given how similar digital addiction is to other addictive substances, do we need government restrictions in place, similar to what we have for drinking, smoking, and gambling? I will answer absolutely. We need all of these interventions, from education to culture change to laws being passed. Emily, you want to add one?
Lawsuits.
Lawsuits. I mean, that's what it took really to force big tobacco to no longer have the hold that it had over people's lives. And I think it's going to take the same to sort of wrestle big tech to the ground. So before we wrap up tonight, I'd like to ask everyone if they would be willing to complete a quick survey on this Expert Insight series that's dropped into the chat right now. It'll just take you a moment, and your feedback would really help us going forward. And while you're looking at that, I really want to extend my sincere thank yous to Jim and Emily. Tackling the national emergency in youth mental health requires leadership on so many different levels. And it's an honor to have both the Screentime consultant, as Emily is known, the Screentime consultant,
That's right.
and the psychologist, addiction expert, and research coalition leader that Jim is, together to weigh in on this complicated, difficult issue. So thank you all for coming. You can join us in fighting back against media addiction and help us prioritize a truly tech-intentional future by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at joinmama.org. And we also hope you'll join us next month, when I'm very excited to announce our guest will be Super Nanny Joe Frost for our next Expert Insight Series event on March 6th to talk about protecting healthy child development and parenting and the challenges of parenting. Registration is open for that event, and we're dropping the link into the chat. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Jim. Have a great night.
Thank you.
So much. So nice to meet you both. Thank you for having me.
And thank you everyone for tuning in and for completing the survey. Have a great night.